Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia. My guest today is award-winning Christine Paice, author of the incredible new novel, The Oxenbridge King, which has just been published by HarperCollins Australia. Listeners, to say that this was a novel I enjoyed would be an understatement. This is a book that takes you back in time, giving you a glimpse into a bygone era and ruminates on events we can only speculate about. A clever, funny, and at times heart-wrenching story, this book is enthralling and intriguing in equal measures. Inspired by the discovery of the bones of Richard III beneath a car park in England back in 2012, Christine has crafted a stunning, beautifully written novel that blends both fact and fiction in an utterly unique way. Christine is the author of another novel called The Word Ghost and a children's book called The Great Rock Whale, along with two poetry collections, Staring at the Aral Sea and Mad Oaks. Her work has been published in a variety of journals and has been performed on BBC Radio 3 and Radio National, amongst other places. Christine won the prestigious Josephine Ulrich Poetry Prize in 2009 and has been shortlisted for a host of other prestigious awards as well. When Christine isn't writing, she works as a manuscript assessor and creative writing mentor. And I am simply delighted to have the chance to speak with Christine about her novel on the podcast today. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here.
What a novel, Christine. I was simply awestruck by your writing prowess in crafting this novel. So I wanted to say congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, how long was this story in the pipeline before it was published? From inception to submission, how long would you say that you worked on it?
Well, I can tell you exactly. It was 7 years of madness. The inception took a couple of years of reading, researching, thinking, writing experimental scenes and writing poetry, because one of the first things I started with when I became excited about the discovery of the king, being a poet, I wrote a poem to him. And I wrote a poem called Talking to the Bones of Richard. And I imagined, instead of me talking to him, oh king, oh discovery, you know, how great you are, or how bad you are, or how terrible you are, or who are you, what would it be like if he actually spoke back to me? So 7 years later, 3,000 drafts later, many scenes written, cut, and starting again almost, I managed to get to the end of a draft that would become a book. So yeah, 7 years from start to finish, I think.
My goodness, that's a marathon by anyone's standards.
It is, but I mean, you know, life happened along the way. So there were many times during that 7 years when I wasn't sort of actively writing the book. And I think from the year 2020, when COVID started, that was when I really knuckled down, started my master's, and got up at 5 o'clock every morning, went down to the garage, lit my candles, absorbed the atmosphere, and really thought, right, I'm going to pull all this together.
Oh, absolutely amazing. Now, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, I vaguely knew about the discovery of Richard III's bones in a car park in England and the subsequent reinterment of those bones. But I wondered if you could fill us in on your interest in this event as a source of inspiration for the novel.
Sure. Well, I mean, what's not to love about discovering a medieval king, and not just a medieval king, but one of England's most notorious medieval kings, underneath a car park with a space that's written, got R for reserved on it. And as the archaeological dig unfolded, and Philippa Langley, the lady whose intuition it was that provoked the dig in the Greyfriars, the site of where the Greyfriars Priory was, as everything unfolded and you started to see pictures, and then the archaeologists brushing the dirt off the bones, and then you started to see a skull, and then you saw a backbone, and then you saw, oh my God, the backbone actually had a curve to it. And then everyone's going, oh, well, it doesn't mean that that's Richard III. And Philippa Langley's going, yes, of course, it does mean that's Richard III. I knew he was there. And the people from the University of Leicester, the team, are the archaeologists and the forensic scientists are all working on the bones, it started to unfold. The reality of Richard coming up as a skeleton meant that all of his life came up as well, and all of his death and everything associated with this king. It was as if he was saying, I am here, now you can have another look at me. And I was fascinated by the sight of the actual bones of this king, because it's a very intimate discovery. He can't control anything anymore. But when you go to the Tower of London, you can see the armour that Charles I wore, and that's very exciting. And you can see the armour that Henry VIII wore, and that's really exciting because you can almost feel the presence of these men inside these suits. But when you have somebody's skeleton, it's a vulnerable sight. He cannot account for his bones. He can't protect himself. He's stripped to the absolute barest part of himself. And so there was almost like a national tenderness towards this discovery of this king that I kind of shared in as well. When you're presented with somebody's bones, you sort of have to protect them. And so I felt drawn to the sight of these bones, and I always wanted to do something with them, and it just took me a while to work out what that would be. I didn't want to write about his life because there's millions of books about the life of Richard III, and being me and being interested in the afterlife, a hobby, the afterlife, I wanted to do something different. But in order to write about his death, I absolutely had to write about his life and know about his life as well. So that was the beginning of it.
So before we go any further, I wondered, for the benefit of those who haven't yet read the book, if you could just tell us a little bit more about the story.
Okay, sure, I'd love to. So the story begins in 1485, and it's right after the Battle of Bosworth, when one of England's most notorious kings, King Richard III, is killed. And he begins his journey into the afterlife, accompanied by a talking raven. And on their journey into the afterlife, Raven is searching for an angel who will eventually be required to carry the soul of the king up to heaven. But where is that angel? That angel started his life as a monk called Daedalus in the Abbey of Stern in a small village in Oxenbridge. And that's the place where the king stopped in my fiction to ask the monks and nuns to pray for him. And he required the presence of Daedalus and Father Jessup to accompany him to assure him of victory. But Daedalus and Father Jessup missed the actual battle and didn't arrive in time. And so they returned to the Abbey of Stern, Daedalus in rather a guilty state and upset because the king who they were meant to pray for and protect had been killed. And Daedalus became a little too close to Sister Alice and got into an argument with the youngest member of the Abbey of Stern, Silas, who ended up pushing Daedalus down the steps that lead to the crypt below the tunnels of the Abbey of Stern. And 500 years later, Daedalus awoke and discovered that he was in the cellar of Oxenbridge House, and there was a young woman, Molly Stern, who had arrived home to Oxenbridge House for Christmas. And Molly discovered that not only were there strange noises in the cellar, because she didn't know what was causing them, but her aunt and beloved Uncle Frank were becoming obsessed with the bones of King Richard. And that's sort of how the medieval world and the modern world meets. And what happens next? Well, people will have to read the book to find out.
What I really loved about this is it goes between the two timelines. You've got the historical and what happened around the time of Richard III's death and the aftermath of that. But then also, you've got the contemporary timeline of 2013, which is about the time Richard III, he was discovered a year earlier. So you've kind of got some real-time events happening in the contemporary timeline, which I thought was so fascinating.
He was discovered in August 2012. He was DNA profiled, and it was 99.9% certain that this was Richard in February 2013. And then he was reinterred in March 2015. So there's a timeline of about 3 years from his discovery to when he was reinterred. But even then, in that period of time, certainly in England, he was very disruptive to people, because there were people who were on the side of Richard is the good guy. He did good things as a king. He didn't murder the princes. We don't know what happened to them. This is Philippa Langley. You know, you're a Ricardian on one side, and then you're an anti-Richard. He was a bad king. He was evil. He killed the princes. He took the throne for himself, and people wanted him buried in York because he was a son of York, and he lived up there in Middleham Castle. And so I felt like he was actively disrupting the idea of who he was again in a completely different way. And it was fascinating to read because there was almost not a day went by when King Richard III wasn't in the papers in some way. And I thought he would have actually loved that.
As you say, the novel opens with Richard III's death on the battlefield at Bosworth, and he was defeated by Henry Tudor, who subsequently claimed the throne. This was quite a momentous historical event on many levels, wasn't it?
It certainly was, because it was the end of the Plantagenet kings and it was the beginning of the Tudor era. And so many people were measured in the Tudor era as to how their parents or grandparents, which side they were on for Bosworth. So the political unrest spilled over into Henry VII's reign. He was always cautious that there were people who really were on the side of the Yorkists, and the Plantagenets were sort of undermining him and lurking around. And of course, the princes in the Tower, the sort of epicenter, the absent epicenter of this book and of the mystery of King Richard, weren't anywhere to be found. Like, Richard hadn't produced their bodies. Henry VII went sniffing around looking for them and couldn't find them. And then there were two pretenders that came along, two young boys, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. And, you know, were these boys the missing princes? Had they managed to escape? And I think it's such an endearing mystery, because the age of the boys when they entered the Tower meant that they were so young and so vulnerable. And I think that was where I decided to concentrate the emotional energy around this, that if you take two boys into the Tower of London and one's expecting to become king after the death of his father, and his younger brother joins him in preparation for the coronation, and then I think Raven actually says this in the book, a few weeks later, you take the crown and you're wandering around with it on your own noggin. You take the crown that belonged to the young boy. You have a certain duty of responsibility, surely, at some stage, no matter what your belief as to the boy's legitimacy or illegitimacy, conveniently for Richard. I think you have as an uncle and somebody who's sworn to protect them, you have a duty of care that those boys are somehow going to be okay. And I think for me, he didn't act on that duty of care. And it was all very easy for him to sweep the idea that he didn't have to away because they were illegitimate, which is also strikes me as an incredibly convenient discovery right at the time when he would need it to be. And I think that vulnerability is what I wanted to concentrate, that emotional vulnerability about two boys. And I sort of feel protective for them. And I feel like all of the Ricardians, he was a good man. The princes weren't dead. He didn't, of course, Richard didn't kill them himself. But there are so many questions that abound. And I want to say, well, he didn't make a very good fist of looking after them, did he? That's kind of what I want to say. I mean, that's your responsibility, mate. You were the Lord Protector, you were their uncle, and things didn't go right for them. And so where's the balance, kind of thing?
I think you have made that position entirely clear, particularly through Raven, who is, makes no bones about the way he feels about Richard III's role in the princes going missing. And I mean, Richard III's ascension to the throne in 1483 was controversial. And I raise this because it had significance for the central question that he has to grapple with in the afterlife. I'm completely fascinated by the way in which you've linked the discovery of the king's remains with this notion of the afterlife and how this collides with events in the present. So I wondered if you could take us through your thoughts on this. Were you especially interested in exploring what might happen to a person's soul after their death?
Yes, I really was. And a question that I had in my head, that I'd had almost from the start through those 7 long years of madness, was, what's the point of being good if there's no idea of punishment or comeuppance in the afterlife? What propels you to be a good person during your life? Now, this was completely the opposite way around for Richard. He was very pious, I'm sure he believed in his own goodness, and I'm sure he believed that he did enough meritorious things during his life through prayer, through deed, although many of his deeds were very bloody, but he believed he was on the right side of virtue as he did them. And so by going into the afterlife for Richard, I wanted to look at, well, what if it just wasn't what you were expecting, mate? Okay. Yes, you're pious. Yes, you've paid priests in to say prayers for you. Yes, you've said your mass. You're a good Catholic man. You've crossed yourself. You've believed in heaven. You think the angels are going to be there. But let's have a look and see. Can you do such tremendous, life-changing, disruptive activities to become king, even though that's all within the bounds and guides of being medieval, i.e. doing what you had to do to become king and to stay king and to promote your family's well-being over anybody else's, and then expect that it's all going to go your way and that the afterlife is just going to be this great big beautiful garden. Welcome, Richard. Doesn't matter about the boys. Have a seat, have a glass of mead, put your feet up. Congratulations for becoming king. I just didn't see that it was going to be like that. And I wanted that question, what's the point of being good? Well, let's have a look and see what happens. In the afterlife, for somebody who believed they were good, but actually may not have been. I wanted to show that and say, look, mate, two young boys. It's all very well nobbing around on your horse, going up and down England, saying I'm the king and getting people on your side, but just not a very good way to be. And I wanted to show that. So I hope I did.
Yeah, you absolutely did. And as I said before, Raven didn't want King Richard to get away with anything. He was telling him in no uncertain terms that in order to achieve redemption and go to heaven, he needed to acknowledge what he had done
Yeah.
wrong in his lifetime. And it took him a while to get there.
Well, it did, because I think it was unexpected, but it was very important, because when he died, he wasn't in his bed. He wasn't surrounded by his family. He didn't have time to make a confession. The priests didn't say mass. He wasn't blessed and loved out of this world in a way that other medieval kings were, and in a way that was very important for medieval people to have those last rites, to go through the rituals of leaving one world and entering the next. And I think I wanted to get him to a state where he actually had to say something about what had happened. And you're right, Raven, God bless Raven, he just sat on his shoulder. He wasn't going to let him get away with anything. But I think that was powerful for him to be sort of crumbling and nearing the end of his soul-like life, and then for Richard to sort of actually be able to step forward and say, this is the truth, and this is what happened. This is his truth, because truth can be difficult to ascertain, and I think particularly any idea of truth around Richard III is very difficult to pinpoint, because everybody's truth is an opinion as well, wrapped up in that truth. And facts are very blurry when you start to look at sources and history. And so that was lovely for me to be able to write Richard like that, because for a long time I just had Daedalus and Richard in the afterlife, having a chat for 500 years. And Richard was saying, oh, I had a great coronation. I had lots of really nice things to eat during my coronation. And Daedalus was going, oh, yeah, did you? So I had to kind of make something more fierce happen, if you know what I mean.
As I said, this was the central dilemma that Richard III's soul had to contend with in the afterlife. And you talked a little bit earlier about the Princess in the Tower, and I have to say I didn't really know much about that before reading your book. But I was really fascinated by your exploration of his mindset about that, how he felt about the princes and how he ascended to the throne was quite speculative. And so I was really interested to understand how you came to be wanting to explore that side of him.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because when you look at historical sources, Richard didn't leave a diary saying, woke up May 1483, feeling a bit vulnerable and threatened by the Queen of England's family, so have decided to enlist the help of my good friend the Duke of Buckingham, and we shall ride together, and I will get rid of all of the uncles surrounding the young prince, and I shall be victorious. It's just not that simple. You have to cobble together the idea of somebody's frame of mind through their actions. Morality is an internal process, but how you manifest the merits of your morality are through actions and external activities. And that is very easy to see with Richard. You look back at history and people don't know what they were going to do before they did it. Like, his brother died. He found out about a week later, a messenger arrived and told him he had a letter from Lord Hastings, who's one of the supporters of his brother. The Queen's family are gathering forces and the young prince is marching to London, and if he gets there and the Queen crowns him, and where are you? And so I think there was a great big muddle in 1483, and Richard's actions of meeting up with the young prince and immediately imprisoning his uncles who had been with the young prince since he was small at Ludlow, training him for the purpose of becoming king. I think you judge Richard by his actions, and you could say that they were for self-preservation, but they were also not very nice. And I always think that his frame of mind is, we're able to see and judge it from what he did. And even though Philippa Langley says, he was acting for, she has a sort of a really strong thread of logic and rationality for why he acted like that, but you can just as easily just move that thread a little bit to one side and say, well, this was very, very thought out and deliberate, and not very nice to imprison people and kill them just because they were protecting and guiding a young boy who you wanted to become. You wanted to move yourself more into that position of power and importance. So I think his morality and his frame of mind, I tend to see through his actions and sort of take that into the afterlife as well. So he's walking, he's in a cloak of feathers, he's having to sit in a chair, he's waiting for Raven, and he has a lot of time to think in a way that he wouldn't have done when he was alive. And I think that's quite important too. I don't think Richard ever sort of sat around swinging his legs on a chair, pondering the great questions of life. I think he was in life and he had to make decisions that were very difficult and big. And that's how I judge him.
Christine, I imagine it's evident that quite a great deal of research went into the crafting of this novel. But are you able to shed any light on the kinds of research that you did to bring all of these events to the page?
Claudine, I did so much research. So I did lots on the internet. When I was in England looking after my mum, I went to the British Library and I accessed some sources there, and a lovely guy called Jeff helped me get everything that I needed. And I think the closer I got to the original sources, the more exciting and more intimately connected I felt towards Richard. I spent a few months in York and I was able to go to the cathedral, the York Minster, which was the place where he had sworn to be the Lord Protector when his brother had died. I went to the Archbishop's Palace, which is the place where he then invested his young son as a Prince of Wales in 1483 in September. And I went to the wonderful York Explore Library, little plug there, and accessed the council minutes that the council had met and written down their commiserations after the death of Richard. And you can see the original handwriting, and it just brings you closer to the names of the people. You can almost feel their faint breath rising off the documents as you're reading them. And so I think that was the real underpinning of my research. But I mean, my research never stops. It just goes on all the time, because I'm reading about the Missing Princess Project. I'm reading and I go back and I do retrospective fact checking, and then I do forward research, if that doesn't sound too clunky. So I'm just all the time reading and thinking and writing. It's so exciting to get a document that's 500 years old, and you put on your white gloves and the librarian places it onto a big comfy pillow, and you turn the pages and you're thinking this was actually written by Henry VII by Richard. And you imagine the little pen, the quill, dipping it into the ink, and you imagine the hand, and the writing is so difficult to understand. I mean, you think you read a letter written 500 years ago, you've got Buckley's chance of being able to understand what's in that letter. You're going, right, I don't even know what character this beginning character is. So there's so many different layers of discovery when you're looking at documents, and then you start to pull feelings and thoughts together from the original material. It's a fascinating process.
Now, Christine, the village of Oxenbridge, the place where most of the events of the novel take place, is a fictional village, but was it based in any part on a real place?
Ah, well, Claudine, I'm not allowed to tell you where I based that on. It is a fictional village, all right, and it's a very familiar place to me, and it's going to stay forever secret.
Okay, so then tell me about the catacombs underneath the remains of the Abbey of Stern, which is a fictional abbey. Were these based on a real place? Maybe they're two different places. I don't know.
Well, I did heaps of research into subterranean dwellings, caves. Then I got involved in people who'd suffered terrible deaths in caves and couldn't get out. And once you start doing research into one area, it just expands. But what it was based on in my mind was, I don't know if you've read The Weird Stone of Brisingamen by Alan Garner, one of my all-time favourite books. And he has two children, Colin and Susan, on this massively great, fearsomely magical wild adventure in diving down into tunnels and this whole underground magical realm where they're being chased by frightening shapeshifters, and there's a wizard down there. And in my head, that was what I was trying to do in an adult grown-up novel. I wanted it to be real and not so real that you couldn't imagine it. So it was mostly made up, really, but inspired by The Weird Stone of Brisingamen.
Let's talk about Molly for a bit. The intersection of the grief that Molly in the present timeline is suffering after the death of her beloved father and the reawakening of Richard III's soul in the catacombs is fortuitous and something that leads to Molly's own reawakening in some respects, doesn't it?
Yes, I think there's all sorts of things happening at the same time. So Molly is searching for something deeper. And so you can look at the what's going on below ground as a sort of metaphor for the unconscious, if you like, which I guess it is. She's searching for her mother. She's searching for a reason to tie everything together. Why does she feel like this? She can see that something isn't quite right between her aunt and uncle. And her uncle's obsessed with the bones of the king. And I think the story that her father told her when she was little, that all of the noises in the house belonged to an angel, suddenly starts to become a little bit more real in her. Instead of being a childhood story, it actually turns out that that is a real event. And I think her discovery for that means that she's pulling together the missing parts of her life while she's feeling sad and upset. And you sort of exist in a different dimension when you're in a state of grief. And I think that allowed her to accept Daedalus coming into her life, and it allowed her to accept that there were other things going on as well, that it wasn't, life isn't straightforward. But when you're in a state of, what does Joan Didion calls it, the year of magical thinking, when you do think differently when you're in a state of grief, and things that were once important are less important, and the big real things, the deep things that have to come up to you from underneath, become the only things that you're really after, because they're the big questions in life that you need answered. Like, why do I feel like this? What is going on? And what does life really mean?
I want to talk about Daedalus in a second, but first I want to talk about Raven and where he came from. And for me, it was it was really hard not to make the connection between the ravens at the Tower of London and this raven. They're kind of like a little bit foreboding in so many ways, but he acted, as you said earlier, like a conduit or as an escort for the souls between the place he called Threadbare, which I kind of took to mean purgatory.
Raven is my avatar. Raven will say all the things that I want to say in the way that I want to dare not say them. The ravens at the Tower of London are iconic. And I thought also that if anyone can go between time and different dimensions, Raven can do it, because it's really too hard to get a person, apart from Daedalus, shifting from one time into another very easily. I'd always had a sort of talking bird, and some talking beast in my ear. And once I'd got the character of Raven, I felt as if I could do anything with him. And he just sort of accompanied me and said, all right, let's do this. And he was the voice in my ear that sort of pushed me on. And he's almost like my best literary friend, and I'd be a bit lost without him. Raven is really easy for me to write, and it's almost as if once I'm in the voice of Raven, I can barely control myself because it's just so exciting for me to be able to have that character to channel things through.
Yeah, and I was going to say that you absolutely nailed his voice. I mean, he was very forthright in his opinions and he didn't mince words with anybody.
It was perfect to have a bird that can be a bit of a smart ass. Like, when he's trying to get Frank to say, where's Daedalus, where's this angel guy? And he's trying, and Frank's just terrified of this great bird looming out of the darkness. And I think also in order to talk to the king, I didn't want somebody who was like a kowtowing courtier. Oh, do come into the afterlife, Richard. I wanted, right, okay, mate, let's go. I wanted something a little bit edgier, and Raven was perfect.
He certainly was. He certainly was. Now, I love a little bit of woo woo in novels, and this book certainly explored the idea that the essence of us remains even after death. Molly hears her father long after he's gone, and even poor young Edward continues to hear and see his dead mother. Is that something that you were keen to explore in this novel as well?
Yeah, for sure. Because I think when somebody that you love dies, you don't stop having a relationship with them. And often, I think one of the things that you miss most is talking to somebody, especially if somebody is very close to you and you've loved them and they've loved you. And I think we do these things. We do, talk to people in our heads. We talk to ourselves in our heads. And to be a writer is you always have voices in your head, not in the way that makes you totally mad, but you're always thinking of lines. And as a poet, I'm also thinking of lines of poetry, and things pop into my head. So for me, it's a really natural way of writing to have somebody talking to somebody who's no longer with them, but in a way that's quite out loud, like Molly talks to her father out loud. And I think she finds that reassuring. And often if you're lonely and you're lost, talking to yourself is probably quite one of the most sane things to do.
The other thing that you've explored so poignantly in this novel, Christine, is family, what it is and how healing having a loving family is. Aunt Peggy and Uncle Frank, while not parents themselves, are stand-in parents to Molly and love her just as much as any parent could love their own child. And in many ways, I thought it was Molly also acknowledging their love for her, which helped her through her grief too, don't you think?
Yeah, I think completely. To me, this book is so much about forgiveness. And I think Molly has been angry. When you're grief stricken, you become angry that the person you love the most has left you. And you don't know what to do with that anger. And over time, that anger will dissipate. But she found a focus for that with Peggy and Peggy's secret about Molly's mother. And I think that anger that leads to forgiveness is one of the most powerful emotional safety nets that a family who is a loving family can offer the other members when things go wrong. Anger can be destructive and very difficult, but forgiveness is the other side of anger, I think. And to have Peggy and Frank 100% available for all of Molly's emotional needs once they'd sorted themselves out was the safety net in which Molly could then be angry, explode, and put herself back together again. And I think that was something I wanted to show. The strength of family is something that we often take for granted, but it's, for me, one of the most important parts of being alive is that there are people who have birthed you, grown you, raised you, know you better than you almost know yourself, and no matter what happens, they will endure. And that's a powerful thing, and I wanted to show that.
The idea that angels and spirits walk amongst us is not a new one, but you've explored this in such a unique way. Do you have a particular interest in angels?
I almost did. And I say that because when I was writing Daedalus, at one stage, I had him with a pair of wings, and I had him walking across the lawn of Oxenbridge House, dragging his wings. And I had people coming to the ruins of the abbey, looking at this angel, and he was floodlit, and it was like this amazing visual, incredible psychic event. But at the same time, writing a character who can go into tunnels and rescue people with wings is very difficult. So I found myself having to sort of pull back from the brink of looking at angels' lives, the hierarchy of angels, how did angels become angels, and just sort of making him much more human, to embed the idea that spiritual and psychic things do happen when we're alive, because we have minds, we have hearts, we have energies, we have auras, we have ways of being in the world that pull things to us. And I wanted to show Daedalus as being part of that world, but also being quite human as well. So yes, I mean, who doesn't love an angel? Who doesn't want to fall in love with an angel? And who doesn't want an angel to go shopping with them every day? I mean, you know.
Looking after them and embracing them. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell me about Daedalus. Was he inspired by any creature or person, real or mythical?
I first got the idea for Daedalus when it sounds strange. We were driving home from basketball on the Wollongong Highway, and it was dusk, and the escarpment was this sort of like big spine in the inky blackness, and then a huge flock of flying foxes flew over all the cars on the freeway, and we had to put our lights on and slow down. And as I was watching all of these, you know how they fly slightly erratically, they don't fly quite as smoothly as birds, and they've got these weird little heads, and they were just sort of flapping around, all zooming around all over the car. And into my head popped this scene of a man who was half naked, sprawled over a dining room table. And that was how Daedalus popped into my head, with the bats surrounding the car. And I knew he was going to be called Daedalus, and I don't know how I knew that, but I just did. And that was how he arrived. And that was the first scene of the whole book that arrived in my mind. And Daedalus was also the father of Icarus, and he made his wings, and he created the labyrinth to imprison the Minotaur for King Minos. So I thought, well, if Daedalus is going down into the underground at some stage, this is quite a good name. And so that was how the beginnings of him appeared.
Just wonderful. I love that story.
It's so true. I had this scene in my head of this man sprawled over a dining room table, which became the scene where he's first up in the house with the family having their roast dinner. And I couldn't get it out of my head. And it took me quite a while to work out, what do you do with a half-naked man disrupting somebody's roast dinner? And that was how I wrote the book, really.
So, Christine, if there was one thing that you would like readers to take away from this novel, what would that be?
That's a really good big question, Claudine. I would like them to know that family and forgiveness are the most important things in life. Forgiveness is really hard to do, really hard to ask for, but profoundly important, because we all do things that are dark and difficult and that we don't want to do, or that we're ashamed of in some ways. But if you can ask the people who love you for forgiveness, that's a very powerful thing. And if Richard can ask for forgiveness, then this is a world where everyone can do the same.
So then, begs the question, are you working on something else at the moment?
Yes, I am. And I think we have to move sideways a little bit and look at the Duke of Buckingham, because he's one of my favourite characters as well. And I'm writing, it's at the moment, it's a series of short stories, but it's about his role in the rebellion after Richard was king, and he was actually caught and executed. But I'm thinking, in the same way that I did with Richard, is what if he wasn't caught, and what if I can show that he actually had something to do with the disappearance of the princes? So that's my next thing, I think.
I love the way your mind works.
I'm thinking, I just should write something normal, straightforward, like a spy thriller or a story, and then I go back to the Duke of Buckingham and I just think, oh man, I love you. You're a difficult, silly man, and I really enjoy looking at you. So what can I do with you, kind of thing.
There's a thriller and a spy story right there. We've got plenty of contemporary ones.
I think so. I think so. The greatest unknown spy in the world, the Duke of Buckingham.
Christine, as a creative writing mentor, you must come into contact with lots of aspiring authors. So I was wondering if you had any tips that you could offer to writers out there trying to get published.
That's a great thing to ask. Yes, I do. So first of all, read. Read those people who inspire you. Read people who don't inspire you. Read people who have written books that you want to write. And if you think there's no one out there who's written a book that you want to write, you will be wrong, and there will be somebody out there. So read, 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 and then write small. Don't set yourself such a huge ballooning task like this is going to be the novel of the century. Just write small, and then ask yourself, and don't judge yourself when you're writing. There'll be plenty of time for others to judge you, but allow yourself the grace to write what's in your heart and in your mind and in your interested brain. Write that, don't judge it, and finish it. Bring it to some kind of conclusion if you can. It doesn't even matter how long it is. It could be just a paragraph on a page. And then ask yourself, what is the one defining word that's driving why and what you're writing? So for me, the Oxenbridge King, my defining word has been, and I didn't know it for quite some time, about forgiveness, but there's always a word that's at the heart of what you're trying to achieve. And if you can't find the word, ask yourself what your story is about in a couple of sentences. And if you can articulate your story in 25 words or less, you're getting to the heart of something. And don't stop. Writing is a world of doubt and negativity, frustration and difficulty. And if you do anything right, then it has to be like that for you to come out the other side and have a sense of achievement. Writing is not an easy task, and it's difficult and profoundly rewarding if you stick at it. So read, write, don't judge yourself, find a word, finish it.
Christine, I am in complete awe at what you've managed to achieve with this magical and wondrous novel. Congratulations on your success. Thank you very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, Claudine, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for such a positive, warm welcome for the Oxenbridge King.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.